This evening's reading is from Genesis 41, and that's chapter 41, verses 37 to 57, which, if you're using one of the Pew Bibles, is page 46. And before the reading, just a short introduction to set the scene, so to speak. Joseph has just been summoned from his prison cell in order to interpret Pharaoh's dreams for him. God has given him the interpretation. There will be 7 years of abundant harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph has then suggested that someone should be in charge of storing up food reserves before the famine. So at verse 37, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He made him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere.
We're looking as a one-off tonight at this chapter of Genesis, chapter 41, and it's an amazing turning point in Joseph's story as he skyrockets from being prisoner to prime minister, essentially, in a matter of minutes. And like most of Genesis, I think the main way that God is going to be working on our hearts this evening is to help us to trust him more and trust his son, Jesus Christ, more. This chapter, I think, works towards that in some very specific and powerful ways. And we will come to that towards the end. But first, and for the majority of our time, I actually want us to just dwell in the story and soak it up in a little bit more detail. So, do come with me in your mind's eye to the courtroom of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Imagine it, a wide, echoing room, courtiers, advisors, magicians gathered around the edges. At the head of the room, a large throne, with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, sat on it, ornately dressed. And standing before him, a foreign man, plain clothes, shoddy haircut, half bowing in supplication, but addressing Pharaoh in a loud, clear voice so that everyone can hear. Here is Joseph. He's just been hauled out of jail to interpret Pharaoh's troubling dreams to him. The interpretation: God has ordained 7 years of plentiful harvests, followed by 7 years of famine. So it's good and bad news. Probably mostly bad news if you weigh it all up. The court, I imagine, has gone very quiet. What's Pharaoh going to say? What are we going to do if this is true? But let's just press pause on the story there, because before we go on, I want to rewind a little, because this scene is even more pressured than you might think. So firstly, rewind maybe 3 or 4 years, something like that, to the moment when Joseph is thrown in jail. And he's shouting out as the guards slam the prison door, "I didn't do it. I've only ever been a loyal servant to Potiphar. His wife just made up the whole story." He's unjustly imprisoned. And go back a little further and see Joseph weeping as the shackles are fastened round his wrists, his brothers avoiding eye contact with him, counting their money, joking amongst themselves. Back a few months before that, hear Joseph earnestly explaining to his brothers and his father, "My 2 dreams, they were so alike. Your sheaves of wheat gathered round my sheaf and were sort of bowing down to it. And then the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. I didn't ask for this, but I think God means for me to rule over you." So in tonight's scene, as Joseph stands in that courtroom, where is that promise from the dream? Where is God? But there's even more than just Joseph's personal story on the line here. Come back a few years even before that with me, and now see Joseph's father, Jacob. He's stooping over the father of his dad, Isaac, to receive a blessing. "My son," says Isaac, "may nations serve you, and peoples bow down to you. Be lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you." Where is that promise? Nations serving you, peoples bowing down to you? Jacob, he's still alive, but his family are nomads, nobodies. They've got no influence over any nation. Quite the opposite. Their boy Joseph is a slave in prison. Where is God? Where are his promises? And rewind just one more time and see Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham, standing atop a mountain next to an altar, embracing his boy Isaac, a ram burning on that altar, and hear the voice from heaven, "I will surely bless you, Abraham. I'll make you exceedingly fruitful. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Where is that promise? Abraham's family is not particularly blessed. It's internally dysfunctional. Brothers selling each other into slavery. And as for "in your offspring, all the nations shall be blessed," that's a pipe dream. Where is God? Where are his promises? And just think to yourself, do you ever ask those sorts of questions? God has made big promises to us too. Such big promises. He says he will provide everything we need. He'll give us our daily bread. Really? All things do work for the good of those who love God. Really? Jesus will return. Every tear will be wiped away. Really? Such big promises. sometimes they can feel remote. Sometimes it can feel like we're just sort of left to fend for ourselves a bit. Where is God? Where are his promises? Okay, now fast forward again, back to that courtroom with Pharaoh and Joseph. There's every reason to despair, but let's press play. So in verse 33, Joseph seems to sense something of an opportunity. You can imagine his heart beating pretty fast, sweaty hands. He carries on addressing Pharaoh, having interpreted the dreams. He says, "Let Pharaoh choose a discerning and wise man. Put him in charge of the whole country." Verse 34, "Hire some local overseers to be under him. Get them together to collect 20% of the harvest yields over the good 7 years." Then verses 35 to 36, "Keep it all safely stored away for when the famine does come." That way nobody needs to starve. It's a very sensible proposal, but coming from this nobody with a criminal record, I mean, in the way I picture the scene, it is dead silent in the court at this point. But then, just imagine, Pharaoh stands up from his throne, and slowly a smile begins to spread across his face, and he gestures around the courtroom. Have you guys heard this guy? He's amazing. The Spirit of God seems to be inside him. And he springs down to Joseph and maybe takes him to one side, putting an arm over his shoulder. "Joseph, you know I asked all my best magicians to interpret those dreams. None of them came close. Listen, what would you say if I made you the man over all of Egypt? To see us through this trouble ahead, your suggestions are sound. Your God is with you. You're the man." So then in verse 40, Pharaoh says, "You shall be in charge of my palace." And literally what he says, "According to my command, all my people will kiss the ground before you." Bowing down. It's that idea, bowing down to you. Do you remember those dreams? People bowing down to Joseph? I think it's meant to be an echo. What a moment. So then in verse 42, in front of the whole court, with a flourish, Pharaoh removes a chunky gold ring from his finger and presses it onto Joseph's hand, and everyone knows what it means. Joseph is now in charge. He's got real power. He's king in all but name, second only to Pharaoh. "Bring royal robes for Joseph." Servants appear from the wings. Fine linen is draped over him. A gold chain is hung around his neck. Just think, he had entered this palace as a prisoner. And now, in verse 43, he leaves in a royal chariot, prime minister of Egypt. And verse 43, the footnote will tell you, it literally says, "People shouted before him, 'Bow down.'" Again, remember those dreams? And remember that promise to his father Jacob? "May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you." That's Genesis 27, if you want to look at that later. So, Joseph goes about his business in Egypt. A busy few months. He sets up his office in the capital near Pharaoh's palace. He holds meetings. He issues instructions. He drafts and passes laws. Then he goes out and surveys the land, interviews and hires all these local overseers. He builds storehouses in all the main urban centers. He sets up logistical supply chains. And then, verse 47, the harvest comes in. It's a bumper. People are talking about it as a once-in-a-generation harvest. And Joseph has his 20% siphoned off to the new storehouses, and they're full. And the next year, more barns are built, more preparations, same result, bumper harvest. I would have thought people are starting to talk. Pharaoh, Joseph, seems to have been a pretty inspired appointment. He seems to know what he's doing. He's anticipated these harvests pretty well. The third year, another abundance of grain, Joseph's pretty good with logistics. Just an all-round wise man. Practical, foresighted, sensible. The 4th year. Do you think Joseph has some kind of direct line to the gods? It's been year after year of blessing from heaven. The 5th, 6th, 7th years, Joseph's a household name and he can't put a foot wrong. The grain pours in. All his plans coming to fruition. And in that 7th year, Joseph starts a family. That's in verse 50. He and his wife have 2 sons. And I mean, you know how people sometimes get philosophical around major life events? Joseph does that here as he thinks about the names he's going to call his 2 boys. He pauses and reflects. And so I'd like us to reflect a little bit with him. He just thinks about his own personal story, where he's come from since we paused it in Pharaoh's courtroom. And the names he gives his sons kind of represent his thinking. And it's not necessarily what you would expect. His first son is called Manasseh, and that means made to forget. He's sort of a mix, I think, here. So verse 51 says he chooses that name because God has made me forget all my trouble. Fair enough. But it goes on. God has also made me forget all my father's household. That's interesting. Now, on one level, I think that's fair enough. God has helped Joseph move on in life from the pain of that betrayal from his brothers. But on another level, just think, all of God's promises since Genesis 12 have been to do with Joseph's family. This family will bless the earth. This family will become great. And Joseph's dreams from God, it's his family that's bowing down to him. God has made me forget my father's household. The more I've thought about that explanation of the name Manasseh, the more I think this might just be Joseph potentially distancing himself a little bit from some of God's promises. Almost like he's saying, God, I'm not sure you're going to come through on those. I'll let you off the hook. That's okay. And I think that's kind of sobering. Even though things are looking so good for Joseph in so many ways, at the same time, some of God's promises are going unanswered at the moment. Now, we will know the end of the story. The family is going to be reunited. Things are going to be fulfilled. And that all begins in the very next chapter if you carry on reading. But Joseph doesn't know that, and he doubts. But then his second son's name, Ephraim, God has made me fruitful. This name, in contrast, I think it shows gratitude to God in all the right ways. Joseph has become fruitful. I mean, his children, for one thing, his astronomic rise in Egypt. I think the name shows faith as well. That word fruitful is quite loaded in Genesis. And you can't help but think that maybe Joseph is remembering that promise to his great-grandfather Abraham. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. And if you glance again at verse 49 as well, Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. Again, that's another loaded phrase in Genesis. Another promise God made to Abraham, your offspring will be like the sand that is on the seashore. So I don't think Joseph has forgotten God's promises, or not all of them, at least. God's words to his ancestors, Joseph's ancestors, reverberate throughout this whole story. And I don't think Joseph is forgetting that. He's recognizing it. So what do you make of Joseph at this point? One minute he seems to have given up on God's promises. The next, he's completely full of faith. How is that possible? Surely you've either got faith or you haven't. Well, I guess we all know that it's not quite that straightforward. Faith within us ebbs and flows. One moment we might feel really confident of God's sustaining power in our lives, his care and his hand at work. And then the next minute we doubt and we feel alone. One minute we feel confident, yes, I will be in paradise with Jesus when all of this ends. But then we doubt that, or perhaps we just forget about it and carry on with life. From hope to despair to some kind of forgetful indifference, and then round and round it goes. Do you remember in the Gospels that man who begged Jesus to heal his son, and then he said, I believe, help my unbelief? I think that's it, isn't it? I get that. Faith and unbelief jostle inside us. What do we do with that? What will help our unbelief? Well, hold on to that question. We'll come to it, but first I want to finish the story and see where it goes next. Well, just as Joseph did say in verses 53 and 54, the years of plenty come to an end, and in the 8th year, famine, drought, failed harvests, not just in Egypt, but the whole region. The Egyptian people begin to petition Pharaoh, help us, we won't survive much longer. And Pharaoh just says, don't worry, go to Joseph. He'll sort you right out. Edicts are issued throughout the land, every town, every village. By order of Joseph, open up the storehouses. No one needs to starve. We've prepared for this exact scenario. The surplus grain is to be put out on the market, available for all. The famine is severe, those 7 years. But the people are preserved. They have bread. So that talk about Joseph, I imagine it carrying on, he knew what he was doing, didn't he, that Joseph? What planning, what foresight. And word begins to spread beyond Egypt. Foreigners start to visit. Our crops have failed too. We're on our last reserves, but we've heard you have grain here. We've brought money. Can you help us, Mr. Joseph? Of course I can. There's grain enough for you too, by as much as you need. Imagine the gossip around the nations. Have you heard about Egypt? The man in charge there, Joseph, he has bottomless reserves of grain, always willing to sell it for a fair price. They say he predicted the famine. His God reveals the future to him. That's how they knew to store up this grain. This Joseph has foresight. He planned ahead. Such wisdom and such generosity. The word spreads. Still more petitioners arrive. And they all go home with what they need. And the grain supplies last and last. I believe, help my unbelief. Where does faith come from? Is it something we muster up inside us? A feeling that we can amplify if the conditions are right or if we try hard enough? Those things won't work, not long term. Where does belief come from? Your trust in the Lord will grow as you realize more and more how trustworthy the Lord is. Your trust in the Lord will grow as you realize more and more how trustworthy he is. Remember Jacob, all those years back, receiving that blessing from his father, may nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. No nations ever bowed down to Jacob, but in his son Joseph, it has come to pass. The Lord is trustworthy. Remember Abraham on the mountain? In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Abraham never saw nations blessed. But in his great-grandson Joseph, it's coming to pass as the grain goes out to all the nations. The Lord is trustworthy. The voice of God, words spoken generations ago, echoing, reverberating, setting events in motion over decades, now producing exactly the results that God had always intended. How many of you have one of these with you? A mobile telephone. I expect everybody's got one with you. You don't need to get it out. Now, they're very, very complex phones, aren't they? They're quite beautiful in their own way. Now, to produce something like one of these, it's decades of research. Think about it. Thousands of engineers, designers, programmers, and before that, actually leading up to it, to make any of that possible, we've got hundreds of years of scientific development in mathematics, in physics, in engineering. All of that just to engineer the thing that's in your pocket. What about engineering human history? How much more complex? How many more variables? I mean, if you read history, it's beyond humans to even fully chronicle the past, let alone the future, let alone even controlling the future. The complexity of human history makes a phone seem like a toddler's scribble with a crayon. And yet, our God single-handedly plans and brings to pass every moment. Each seemingly random encounter, each little turning point, and he brings to fruition every last one of his promises. He's more in control than you could imagine. Trust him. But also, as we finish, I'd like us to just think one more time about Joseph. So we've already noticed how he might be a little bit like us when his faith wobbles for a moment. But fundamentally in this story, if we're any of the characters, we're not Joseph. If we are anyone in this story, we're the people that Joseph feeds. We're the ones who come from the other nations. We are helpless. We're starving. We're dying. But we've heard of a man who is a king in all but name, in whom is the Spirit of the Most High God, who has foresight. No famine could ever take him by surprise. He has wisdom and the ability to govern with fairness, to make plans that are sensible and for the good of his people, and who has abundance, food to feed us, water to quench our thirst. A man who shows us compassion when we ask him for help, even to outsiders like us who don't really deserve the time of day from him. Think about this. How often in life do you find a leader who combines these three qualities: compassion, capability, and trustworthiness? Someone who's compassionate, capable, and trustworthy. That's pretty rare. But what a difference it makes that we can come before our King, not Joseph, King Jesus, and petition him, knowing that he is going to listen. He's compassionate. Knowing that he has foreseen all the problems that we will ever face. He's capable. And believing that he will give us everything we need. He's trustworthy. We look at Joseph tonight and we see a shadow, a foretaste of life under the rule of King Jesus. Experienced now, in part, as Jesus sustains and guides us through this life, and to be experienced in full in the new creation under his rule. I'd like us, as we finish, just to close with this description of King Jesus from some words from Isaiah chapter 11. And he sounds very like Joseph. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord. In that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. Let's pray. Our Father, thank you so much for these encouraging words, showing us just how in control of human history you are. Thank you for fueling our faith tonight as we see that you are able to keep every last one of your promises. And we long for the day when we will be under the perfect rule of King Jesus, where nothing need worry us. And we long for that in his name. Amen. Well, our final hymn will help us to put some of that into words, that desire to trust and rest on God and his promises. So let's stand and sing, "We Rest on Thee."
Strong in your strength.
some closing words from Genesis and Isaiah. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord? Amen.